Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's information session for childcare providers participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. My name is Julia Banks, and I am a communications manager in the Division of Early Learning at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, also known as OSSE. And tonight we'll be sharing information about monitoring requirements for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Before we jump into the meeting, we want to take a few minutes to address some housekeeping details and walk through some Zoom features. I'll note that tonight's session is being recorded and that the session will be sent to all childcare providers following the session. So if we move to our next slide, you'll see that we'll highlight a few Zoom engagement features as we have on our previous information sessions. So first, I will highlight the language channels that you can find by clicking the globe icon found on the bar at the bottom of your screen and highlighted on this slide in orange. In addition to offering tonight's session in English, there are also Spanish and Amharic language channels set up. Please click the icon and select the language you would like to tune into. If you're in the English call, you should still click EN for the English call. I will now invite the moderators from the Spanish and Amharic language channels to provide instructions for individuals who would like to attend the session in one of those languages.
Buenas tardes. Hoy estamos ofreciendo interpretación al español. Si usted necesita escuchar esta sesión en español y está en una computadora, deberá seleccionar el canal de idioma. Aparecerá un icono parecido a un globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla de Zoom. Debe seleccionarlo y después seleccionar español. Después, también si usted está en una tablet o en un smartphone, debe hacer clic en los 3 puntos de la parte inferior derecha de la ventana de Zoom, después en interpretación de idioma y después en español. Si no selecciona el idioma, no podrá escuchar al intérprete durante la sesión. Puede seleccionar la opción silenciar el audio original si desea escuchar solamente el español, sin el audio en inglés al fondo. Estas instrucciones estarán en el cuadro de chat.
ጤና ይስጥልኝ እንደምናመሻችሁ። ይህን ስብሰባ በአማርኛ ትርጉም መከታተል ለምትፈልጉ ከስክሪኑ ከታች አካባቢ ግሎብ የዓለም ቅርጽ ያላትን ብርቱካናማዋን ላይ እሷን ጠቅ በማድረግ አማርኛ የሚለውን መርጣችሁ ይህን ስብሰባ በአማርኛ ትርጉም መከታተል ትችላላችሁ። አገባቡ ለኮምፒውተርም ለታብሌትም ለስልክም ተመሳሳይ ነው። መልካም ስብሰባ። አመሰግናለሁ።
Thank you. Now let's walk through a few additional Zoom features that we'll use today. First is the chat feature, which is highlighted on the screen with a green box. We'll use the chat feature to share links and other information with attendees to reference throughout today's meeting. Next is the leave meeting button, highlighted on the screen in purple. If you need to leave the meeting early, you can just click that button. And then finally is the Q&A. If you have questions you'd like to ask during the session, please submit them using this feature. We'll go into a little more detail on how to use the Q&A on the next slide. So if we go to our next slide, you'll see that this is what the Q&A feature will look like on your screen. To submit a question, type it in the box seen here highlighted in red, and then click submit. I'll note that we'll do our best to answer all the questions that come in. If you have questions that are not addressed during tonight's meeting, please email ossie.ecepayequity@dc.gov. Next, I'd like to share that in addition to the language channels, we have the slides that we are presenting today available in Spanish and Amharic. We drop links in the chat at the top of the call to the slides in English, Spanish, and Amharic, and we'll include them again one more time. You can also find them on the slide here. And with that introduction, or with that overview, I'll introduce you to today's speakers. Today, you'll hear from Hannah Matthews, Director of Policy Planning and Research in the Division of Early Learning, and Angela Spinella, the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund Program Manager. Before handing things over to Hannah and Angela, I'll walk through our agenda and make a few important notes. We will start out today's session with an overview of the fiscal year 2024 monitoring policy. The monitoring policy applies to all childcare providers participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. We will then walk through how to submit monitoring documentation. The process we will review is for childcare providers who participate in the Pay Equity Fund but do not participate in the child care subsidy program. I'll repeat that again. The monitoring process we will walk through is for childcare providers who do not participate in the subsidy program. Most childcare providers who participate in the subsidy program and the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will be monitored for compliance with requirements of both programs in the fall and will receive more information about the process for doing so later this summer. OSSI is having subsidy providers complete the monitoring process for both the subsidy program and the Pay Equity Fund at the same time, as many of the reporting requirements overlap, and this will help to streamline the process for providers. I will pause here to make two important notes. First, some subsidy providers will be monitored before the fall because OSSI has received reports of potential non-compliance. Providers being monitored in response to reports of potential non-compliance will receive a notification from OSSI with instructions to complete the monitoring process. Second, there are a small number of childcare providers who operate some facilities that participate in the childcare subsidy program and some facilities that do not participate in the subsidy program. Child care providers who operate a mix of non-subsidy and subsidy facilities will be required to complete the monitoring process we'll be detailing today for the facilities that do not participate in the subsidy program. So after we walk through that monitoring process, we will then have some time for Q&A before closing out. And that is the overview for our agenda for today. So I will hand things over now to Hannah Matthews.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. And hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening on the call. So to begin, we will start with an overview of the monitoring policy for fiscal year 24 of the Early Childhood Pay Equity Fund. We're going to go ahead and put a link in the chat to that monitoring policy that has been disseminated. Again, as Julia said, please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature, and we will get to as many of those as we can at the end of the call. Now, as you all know, in fiscal year 24, OSSI began distributing pay equity funds directly to child development facilities to increase compensation for early educators. We use what we call a child development facility payroll funding formula. OSSI will monitor all providers participating in the pay equity fund who received those formula fund awards. While the process for submitting documentation that's required for monitoring that we'll talk about on this evening's call is for child care providers who do not participate in the child care subsidy program, it's important to understand that the monitoring policy that I'm going to walk through applies to all child care providers participating in the Early Childhood Equity Fund. So everyone will be monitored, and they'll be monitored on the same requirements. The process for submitting information is going to look a little bit different if you are participating in the subsidy program. Each quarter, participating facilities will be monitored for compliance with minimum salary requirements, as well as other requirements that are part of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund Provider Agreement. It's important to note that providers with approved waivers will be monitored for compliance with program and waiver requirements, but those providers are not required to meet the minimum salaries established by OSSI. OSSI will monitor the salaries and credentials of lead teachers and assistant teachers and associate home caregivers employed by participating providers at least annually through review of payroll and related documents, as well as staff records that provide evidence of salaries or wages paid to eligible early educators. The monitoring timeline will be based on when a provider entered into the program. So the earliest that a provider will be monitored is the quarter following receipt of the first quarterly Child Development Facility Payroll Funding Formula Award. We will notify providers when monitoring begins. Providers will receive 30 days notice to submit the required documentation to OSSI. All participating providers are required to submit supporting documentation for the period that is being monitored. On this slide, you can see a table that lays out the time frame for which documentation must be submitted for each quarter. I want to note here that quarter 1 of fiscal year 2024 was the period from October 1st through December 31st, 2023. However, because providers were not required to increase staff salaries until after they received their first payment, childcare providers that received a payment in quarter 1 will be monitored for compliance with salary requirements in the quarter following receipt of the first payment. So in that case, for quarter 1, those dates would be January 1st through March 30th, 2024. Childcare providers will still be required to submit documentation of salaries paid during the quarter they enter the program, but OSSI will not monitor for compliance with the minimum salaries prior to a provider's receipt of their first quarterly payment. That means if you participated in quarter 1, you must provide OSSI documentation of salaries paid between October 1st and December 31st. But we will not expect those salaries to meet the minimum salary requirements until the following quarter. And I'll talk about this some more in terms of the documents that you'll provide on the next slide. All providers will be required to submit the following documentation to meet the fiscal reporting requirements of the Pay Equity Fund. Providers must submit documentation of staff salaries or wages, staff offer letters or hire letters or contracts that are signed, dated, and include salary information. And they also must present evidence of salaries or wages paid to staff, which may include a number of documents such as payroll system documents, canceled checks, payroll tax documents, pay stubs, electronic bill payments documentation, or provider bank statements that show records of payroll transactions. Documentation must be submitted to OSSI for all teachers, assistant teachers, and associate home caregivers who were employed by the provider during the period of review. Documentation is required for staff who were employed in an eligible staff type for any portion of the period being monitored, whether or not the staff person was included in the provider's quarterly award statement. I'll note that home providers and expanded home providers who are self-employed do not need to provide documentation of their own wages or salaries. They will need to provide required documentation for any employees, including associate home caregivers. Now, in addition to the fiscal requirements that I discussed, there are also some additional requirements that we'll be monitoring around. All providers were required to participate in classroom observations as part of the provider agreement. For providers with preschool age classrooms, that means participation in the classroom assessment scoring system, also known as CLASS. For providers with infant and toddler classrooms, that means participation in an environment rating scale, also known as ERS. Providers will not need to submit observation data directly to OSSI. Our partners who administer the CLASS and ERS will report participation of providers and give that information to OSSI. In addition, the provider agreement indicated that participating providers must submit enrollment data to OSSI. Providers must report to OSSI data on enrollment by age group for the month following receipt of the first Child Development Facility Payroll Funding Formula Award and the month following receipt of each quarterly award thereafter. If you do not track enrollment data by month or do not have enrollment data for prior months, you should indicate that in your submission, but you must report current enrollment by age group. Additionally, providers must report tuition data to OSSI. We are asking for the submission of undiscounted current tuition rates by age group. A few things that I'll flag about this requirement. First, the undiscounted tuition rate should not reflect any sibling discounts, any application of a sliding fee scale, or lower rates charged to parents who enrolled prior to a rate increase, or any other discounts the program provides to participating families. So we want the undiscounted rate. Second, programs may report tuition on an hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, or school year basis. That's your decision. You just need to let us know what you're reporting. Third, programs should report the tuition rate that would be charged for a child newly enrolling in the program for the first time in the current month or at the next available enrollment opportunity. For programs that do not enroll children continuously throughout the year, you may report the tuition rate that will be charged for a child enrolling at the next available enrollment opportunity. OSSI will monitor whether providers submit required enrollment and tuition data, but we will not be using this data to evaluate individual programs or determine any compliance. Excuse me. Now, let's walk through some additional reporting requirements for providers with approved waivers of the fiscal year 24 minimum salary requirements. And what I note here, when I refer to waivers, I am talking about providers who have applied for a waiver of the minimum salary requirements. I am not referring to waivers that are received for any other purpose related to licensing. Those providers with approved pay equity waivers will need to share the fiscal reporting requirements that I've shared, so the documentation that we've talked about already, as well as two additional pieces of information. The first is a salary schedule that describes the wages or salaries paid to eligible teachers or assistant teachers following the receipt of the first quarterly award. The minimum wages or salaries paid to teachers and assistant teachers must exceed those paid as of September 30th, 2023. So for those providers with approved waivers, you're going to tell us what your salary schedule is and ensure that it is higher than the wages that you were paying before participation in the program. Providers with approved waivers will also need to submit financial data and reports that demonstrate that those quarterly award payments were utilized solely for the following purposes: to increase wages or compensation of eligible teachers and assistant teachers, including associated payroll taxes, to cover administrative costs associated with implementing the salary scales and meeting OSSI requirements related to the Pay Equity Fund, or to cover costs of health and other fringe benefits for early educators and other child development facility employees. Those are the requirements that were in the waiver policy that you were approved for. Providers with an approved waiver are also required to participate in technical assistance from the District of Columbia Shared Services Business Alliance. You will not need to submit proof of participation in technical support from the Shared Services Business Alliance. OSSI will get that information from Shared Services, who will share with us the child development facilities that have participated in technical assistance. Now, when we receive the information, we will use authoritative data sources to access, accuracy, completeness, and compliance. This means OSSI will review minimum required salaries for early educators in facilities participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund by role and credential. We will look at staffing roles as indicated and approved in the Division of Early Learning licensing tool. The highest credential of staff members, again, indicated with appropriate attachments and approved in the Division of Early Learning licensing tool or DELT. Staff position changes that should be documented by staff change forms or staff resignation or termination letters submitted in DELT, all signed and dated, as well as any other relevant policy guidance or documents published by OSSI for the fund that is appropriate. After providers submit the required monitoring documentation, OSSI will review the documentation and issue monitoring findings to participating providers for the period of review. Based on OSSI's review, a provider will be issued a finding of compliant or non-compliant. Now I'll talk about what that means. So first, for providers without a waiver, those providers will be found compliant if OSSI finds that the minimum salaries are met for all eligible educators. For providers with an approved waiver, to be found compliant will indicate that salaries were higher for all eligible educators prior to that the salaries paid currently are prior to those paid September 30th, 2023, and that funds were spent in accordance with the waiver requirement. Now, for the flip side, non-compliance. Any provider will be found non-compliant if they fail to submit required documentation on the timeline prescribed by OSSI. For providers without a waiver, they'll be found non-compliant if minimum salaries are unmet for some or all eligible educators. And providers with an approved waiver will be found non-compliant if they did not pay eligible staff salaries that exceeded the salaries paid prior to September 30th, 2023, or if they did not use funds solely for the approved purposes listed in the waiver agreement. Any providers that are found to be non-compliant will be given a corrective action plan. The provider then must immediately implement the corrective action plan to comply with the requirements and do one of the following. Either correct the finding and provide proof of compliance with minimum salary requirements that includes a plan for reconciling any pay owed to eligible educators, or submit an application for a waiver for compliance with the minimum salary requirements. Providers who are found to be non-compliant may appeal a determination. Appeals must be submitted using the Request for Non-Compliance review form. The form must include supporting documentation that justifies the appeal. OSSI will review all appeal submissions and issue a determination. All appeal determinations will be approved by the Deputy Superintendent of Early Learning and are final. Should a provider who's found to be non-compliant fail to come into compliance in the timeline designated by OSSI, the facility will remain on probationary status and be subject to increased monitoring. Following 2 non-compliance findings, the provider may be identified on My Child Care DC website as non-compliant with the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Following 3 non-compliance findings, the provider may be terminated from the program for a minimum of 1 year. Providers who are terminated from the program may submit a written appeal to OSSI with documentary evidence. OSSI will then review the appeal submissions and issue a determination. Again, all appeal determinations will be approved by the Deputy Superintendent and are final. Finally, before passing things over to Angela, I just want to leave up here on the slide this visual representation of the monitoring review process. I've walked through a lot, and this helps to kind of summarize the flow of the process. I'm not going to read all of these items, but this is available in order to reference at a later date if there are questions about the flow of the monitoring process. And with that review of the policy, I will now hand things over to Angela.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Hello, everyone, and good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Angela Spinella, and I am the Pay Equity Fund Program Manager. This evening, I'm going to walk you through the process for submitting documentations for monitoring for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Before I do that, though, I'd like to reiterate that the process I will soon detail is for child care providers who do not participate in the Child Care Subsidy Program. Child care providers who operate both subsidy and non-subsidy facilities will be required to complete this process only for their facilities that do not participate in the Child Care Subsidy Program. As Julia mentioned at the top of the meeting, most providers who participate in the subsidy program and the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will be monitored for compliance with requirements of both programs in the fall and will receive more information about the monitoring process later this summer. Next slide. OSSI is collecting monitoring data in 2 different platforms. So giving you that background information, let's talk about this a little bit. OSSI will use 2 platforms to collect documentation for monitoring. The Division of Early Learning licensing tool, also known as DELT, and a Smartsheet. OSSI recognizes that using multiple platforms to submit required documentation may create an additional layer of complexity and work for child care providers. We have selected these platforms in an effort to collect data efficiently, given the functionalities and limitations of the current DELT system, while also ensuring that all platforms used to collect data are secure and protect the privacy of personally identifiable information shared by child care providers about their businesses and staff. As we continue to implement the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, we will also work to improve and refine our reporting systems. To support our providers, we've created a chart that you'll see on this slide that details the various documentation that must be submitted to OSSI and where it should be submitted. The chart also highlights documentation that all participating providers are required to submit an additional documentation that is only required to be submitted by providers with an approved waiver. With that, let's look at how we upload this information into DELT. Next slide, please. You will first need to navigate to the DELT homepage. Next, you will need to log into your provider profile in DELT. You will click on No if you do not have a DCGov or K12.DCGov email account. Next slide. You will then enter your email address or username and password, and then you want to click Sign In. So we're signing into DELT. You then want to make sure that you are navigating to the facility profile page so that you can upload staff hiring letters and update salary types in DELT. Next slide, please. Thank you. You will then select the facility to update using the pencil icon as shown on the left. Once you have clicked on the pencil icon, click the Staff tab. In the Staff tab, click the pencil icon to edit an existing staff record. Scroll down to the Attachments section and click Browse. Here you will upload the staff hire letter or staff contract. Documentation must be uploaded as a PDF. File names must be clear and indicate their content. For example, John Doe offer letter.pdf. Fields with the red asterisk are required to be completed. Next slide. You will then scroll to the compensation section on the same page and select the correct salary type, such as annual or hourly, and enter the staff person's email address. Again, fields with a red asterisk are required to be completed. You will then need to scroll to the bottom of the page and click Save and Close. Please note, if you need to make updates after clicking Save and Close, you will need to contact aussie.childcarelicensing@dc.gov and specify the record you want to update. I will now do a live demo of the Smartsheet form. Bear with me as I share my screen. I should now be sharing the Pay Equity Fund, enrollment data, tuition rates, and payroll documentation Smartsheet link. You will want to scroll down to the facility and license
Angela,
number.
we can't see the.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm
there
glad.
you
Okay, 1 second. Thought that I was sharing that. Bear with me 1 second. Thank you. Okay, let's try that again. Apologies. How about now? Are we showing?
Yes, all good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Julia. Okay. You want to make sure you're scrolling down to the facility or license number section and choose the drop-down arrow to choose your facility and its license number. That would be right here. Next, you want to select the drop-down arrow and choose the applicable month for the enrollment data you're submitting. You want to be sure you enter the enrollment data for the first month of each quarter the facility has been enrolled in the Early Childhood Pay Equity Fund to date. Enter dates for all of the months that apply to the facility. I will demonstrate this now. If I was a provider and the first month that I was enrolled in the Pay Equity Fund was October, here you will see free-flowing text boxes that open up for October, enrollment, January's enrollment, and April's enrollment for for all three infant, toddler, and preschool enrollment. Facilities that do not track enrollment data by month or do not have enrollment data for prior months available can indicate that in the form and will not be penalized, but are required to report the current month enrollment and will be required to report quarterly enrollment in future years. Please be sure you enter the enrollment data for each of the age groups as specified. Infant enrollment, toddler enrollment, and/or preschool enrollment. List the number of children enrolled for the selected quarter by age group. If you do not serve one of the groups, you are not required to enter information into this group's field and should leave it blank. Again, this is a free flow text box. You can type right in there for your enrollment data. You will then want to scroll down on the same Smartsheet form to the tuition section. Here you will enter for each applicable group that is served by the facility. You will be identifying the frequency of the tuition rate reported for each group of children served at the facility. For example, we have daily, weekly, monthly, calendar year, school year, and other for those facilities that do not fall within the other specified frequencies. You will want to choose based on your facility and what you typically charge families for tuition. Complete each box that is relevant to your facility. Facilities that do not track tuition rates or do not have data on tuition rates for prior months available can indicate that in the form and will not be penalized, but are required to report current tuition as of the date the monitoring data is submitted, and will be required to report tuition on a quarterly basis in future fiscal years. As Hannah mentioned earlier, facilities are required to report the undiscounted tuition rate that would be charged for a newly enrolled child who is starting in the program the month the monitoring data is submitted. For example, if you are submitting monitoring data for this facility in July, you would report the rate you would charge for a child enrolling in July. This rate would not and should not reflect sibling discounts, sliding fee scale application, lower rates continuing to be charged to parents who enrolled prior to a rate increase, or other discounts the program provides to participating children and families. If the facility enrolls exclusively children whose parents are employed by a specific employer and charges a discounted rate for those children, you should report that rate. If the facility does not enroll children continuously throughout the year, because the program, for example, operates on a school year basis, report the tuition rate that would be charged for a child enrolling at the next available opportunity. I'm going to now scroll down on the form to our payroll documentation for all providers. You want to be sure if your facility has an approved waiver, you upload additional fiscal and payroll monitoring documentation here. Multiple documents can be uploaded at the same time. Files can either be dragged and dropped into the Smartsheet, or you can also browse for files on your computer. Once all required data and documentation has been submitted, you want to click Submit to share this information with OSSI. If you want a copy of your responses, please check the box, send me a copy of my responses, and then you will just need to type in your email address in the field. That way you are sent a copy of your responses that were submitted to OSSI. If you operate multiple facilities participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, a form must be completed for each facility. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Angela and Hannah. Before heading into our Q&A, we're going to do a quick poll to see what languages everyone is attending today's session in. So you'll see a poll pop up on your screen, and we're asking that you please tell us what language you attended today's session in. And the options are English, Spanish, and Amharic. We'll give folks about a minute to answer the poll question. Alrighty, it looks like the majority of attendees have answered the poll question. So we'll now move into our Q&A. I'll remind folks that we're going to use that Q&A feature for this portion of the call. We'll focus our time today on questions about the fiscal year 2024 monitoring policy and process for submitting documentation. If you have questions related to other topics, such as your facility's quarterly award calculation, please email ossi.ecepayequity@dc.gov. And with that, we will head into our questions. So our first question here is, what if you did not participate previously, but are now participating in the subsidy program? So this sounds like a program that didn't participate in the subsidy program at the start of fiscal year 24 and then started participating in the subsidy program, maybe let's say quarter 3. Do they need to participate in monitoring? And I guess if so, when?
Do you want me to take that, Hannah? Okay, so to answer that question, if you were participating in the pay equity program as a non-subsidy provider, let's say for quarter 1 or quarter 2, you will still be monitored for those quarters. And then for, if let's say this quarter, quarter 3, you switched over to our subsidy program, you will then be monitored later in the fall by our team that will be doing the subsidy monitoring.
Our next question looks to be about the minimum salaries or maybe even use of funds. This person says, we contract for a set amount and subsidies with Pay Equity Fund to bring teachers up to the minimum. For example, we pay them $31 or contracted $31 and we paid them the difference using Pay Equity Funds to bring them to $36.11. Is this correct? I think that might be a question for you, Hannah.
Sure. So first of all, we recognize that providers have different business models and different ways that they are going about meeting the minimum salary requirements. The important piece that we are monitoring around, what we are looking for is to make sure that eligible educators received the minimum salary or wage related to their role or credential. What funds you use to pay those educators those wages is really the decision of the facility. The exception to that are those facilities that have approved waivers, which do need to show that they have used the pay equity funds only in a limited number of ways. But otherwise, a facility can use the revenue available to them, which may include subsidy funds, pay equity funds, tuition payments, to ensure that their employees are being paid the minimum salaries.
Thank you, Hannah. Alrighty, I'm seeing a few folks asking for copies of the presentation. We have dropped links in the chat to the presentation from today in English, Spanish, and Amharic. We will share links to that one more time, and we encourage folks to print those off, review them, and send any follow-up questions that they may have. We'll give folks another minute or so to drop their questions in the chat. All right, here's another question that just came in. How do you address an employee who is on extended leave from the facility, but still employed, but not currently working and have received payment for paid leave?
Sure. So the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund is a revenue source for child development facilities to have the resources to raise wages for eligible employees. So I say that because we are no longer in the phase of the program where resources are tied to an individual educator. You are responsible for ensuring that everyone who is employed during the quarter and is being paid under the whatever conditions, whether it's regular pay or if they're on paid leave or unpaid leave, you should be following those policies around paid leave appropriately so. But if you are currently have an employee for some period of the quarter who is not receiving pay, then you do not need to use those funds specifically for that educator. They can be used to compensate other employees in the child development facility or other acceptable uses of the fund. So think of the funds that you have each quarter as the revenue to your facility to then support increased wages, not tailored to individual educators.
All right, another question here. Are we able to use grant funds to meet minimum wages?
So I'm not sure if there's a specific grant that the provider has in mind, but I'll just repeat the idea that the quarterly payments that facilities receive are one source of funding. We know facilities get any number of sources of funding, including from private pay families, from subsidies, maybe philanthropic grants, and other resources. However you choose to use those funds is acceptable, provided that all eligible educators are meeting the minimum salary requirements. So the monitoring that we're doing is to come and see and look at the payroll documentation to make sure that anyone employed in those eligible educator roles is receiving the appropriate compensation. We will not be looking to track the source of the funds that you use to compensate those individuals.
And maybe, Jarrett, could you pull up the slide that has the minimum salaries listed on it? And here is just to give folks a reminder, these are the minimum salaries by annual salary and by hourly wage based on staff type and highest credential as documented in DELT. So these are the minimum salaries for fiscal year 2024. Let's see, another question, and this is looking ahead to the coming fiscal year, that would be fiscal year 2025. Is the program continuing in 2025?
So I'm very happy to say, for those that have been following the progress on the district's fiscal year 25 budget, that the Pay Equity Fund was included in the budget at $70 million for fiscal year 25. So the program will be continuing in fiscal year 25. There may be some changes to the program based on the funding levels for the program, as well as any recommendations that come out of the reconvened Early Childhood Educator Equitable Compensation Task Force that is meeting to support implementation of the program. So what I will say is, we know that folks are really eager to get information about fiscal year 25. We want to share that information just as soon as we can, but we have been waiting for the budget process to close, and we'll share information just as soon as we have it about how the program will continue in fiscal year 25. But the top line is that, yes, the program will continue next year. So we're very excited about that.
Thanks, Hannah. Our next question is, how many pieces of documentation are needed, or is it just one piece of documentation?
Angela, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so I think I know what this question is asking. And so you are going to be required to submit information in DELT related to salary type and also annual or hourly staff type and the amount. You'll also need to provide backup and supporting documentation for those eligible staff members who are in DELT, who are part of the Pay Equity Fund program for a particular provider. I just want to make sure, like, it's not one or two documents. It would depend on how many staff you had at a particular facility who were in an eligible type as listed in DELT. So it could be multiple pieces of documentation to support that.
Thanks, Angela. I'll pause here. We have a question that's related to fiscal year 25, but I do want to see if there are any questions about monitoring specifically before we answer that question. So I'll give folks another minute. And while we give folks time to do that, Hannah, I'll pose this fiscal year 25 question to you. Our director is going to be included as an eligible staff type in the next fiscal year.
So that's a great question. And again, I understand the importance of wanting to get information on fiscal year 25. Because we are in a process with the Pay Equity Task Force, looking at implementation of the program over fiscal year 25 and the following years. We can't speak to any specifics of the program right now, other than to say that it will continue and we will share information about the eligible educators and minimum salaries and all the information that you all need just as soon as we can.
Thank you, Hannah. I'll give one last call for questions. Otherwise, we'll start closing out. Okay, this is we just got a question that is about if a certain staff type is eligible. So this provider is saying, if we have an employee with a staff type that is substitute, but is currently enrolled in a CDA program, are they eligible?
So currently you would have to have a staff type listed in DELT as assistant teacher or lead teacher. Those are the designations that we would have to see in DELT. And then we also have our home caregiver or expanded home caregivers. Again, associate home caregivers as well.
And I'll just add that those are the staff types that we call eligible educators, who are included in the formula, the way that we run the payroll funding formula to determine the amount of awards that a facility gets. Of course, how a facility uses their award is up to them. And so there may be facilities that use some of the quarterly payment awards to support wages of other employees in the facility. That is okay, provided that you are also meeting the minimum salary requirements for those covered eligible educators.
See, another question, and it's not clear if this is about fiscal year 24 or the next fiscal year, which is still being mapped out, as Hannah mentioned, by the task force. But this question is, would waivers continue to be given?
So the waivers for the minimum salaries for pay equity, the ones that have been approved thus far, continue through the end of fiscal year 24. Any information about the program, including waivers in fiscal year 25, we will be sharing as soon as possible.
Thank you, Hannah. And thank you, Angela. That is our last question from the chat. So we will move to closing out. So thank you, everyone who has joined tonight's information session. We appreciate you all joining us. We encourage you to check out some resources that we have available, including a monitoring guide and the policy that we mentioned at the top of the call. We'll drop those in the chat right now. And we would like to also share that if you have additional questions, you can always reach out to us via email. That is aussie.ecepayequity@dc.gov. And then finally, I'll share that you can find these slides on the Aussie website. We will also be sharing a recording of this session, as well as the session hosted earlier today, in the coming days. So be on the lookout for more information. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.